Hello everyone, I'm Bob Ward, Principal Architect on the Azure Data team here at Microsoft. I'm excited to be here with all of you for Ignite 2022. We've got a lot of great content for you across the board at this event. And if you're interested in some of Microsoft's broader cloud offerings, I encourage you to check out Rohan Kumar's breakout session about our innovation with the Microsoft Intelligent Data Platform. But today, I want to focus specifically on what we've been up to in the world of SQL. In particular, I'm going to talk about how we're making it easier to connect SQL to Azure, gain performance, ensure data integrity, power hybrid scenarios, and accelerate your database in the cloud. In this session, we will also show you new developer experiences for Azure and how Purview can provide you new insights and central governance. And in today's session, we have some new announcements with SQL to make. So let's get started. If you want to learn more about any of the topics I'm about to cover, please join us for our Ask the Experts sessions. During this first part of the session today, I'd like to focus on operational databases, which includes Azure SQL Edge for running SQL on IoT devices, and SQL Server 2022, which runs on Windows, Linux, containers, and Kubernetes. For running SQL in hybrid scenarios, you can connect SQL Server to Azure with Arc-enabled SQL Server. And Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance acts as a managed data service in the infrastructure of your choice. Then, of course, there is Azure SQL, our family of fully managed cloud databases that include SQL Server on Azure virtual machines, Azure SQL Managed Instance, and Azure SQL Database. What really sets this family of operational databases apart from other cloud providers is the fact that we use a consistent SQL engine from the cloud to the edge. And we never stop improving that engine. Speaking of consistency, you can use the same tools and languages across the entire service offering. Let's dive deeper into new SQL innovations. Let's start with SQL Server 2022. If you missed our public preview announcement at Build, here's a reminder that you can download the bits and get started right away. Just go to ak.ms get SQL Server 2022 and start giving us your feedback. You know, we recently created our release candidate for SQL Server 2022, and the excitement is building for general availability. Now let's do a rundown of the major features in SQL Server 2022 and why we believe you will want to upgrade to this release. It all starts with connecting SQL Server to Azure. SQL Server 2022 is now truly a hybrid data platform. It's using Azure SQL Managed Instance for managed disaster recovery. It's using Azure Synapse for near real-time analytics. Or you can integrate with Microsoft Purview for insights, lineage, and centralized policy management, a true hub for security. SQL Server now connects to Azure on your terms in ways never seen before. We know that security is always critical for your data. So not only does SQL Server continue to be the least vulnerable database in the industry, it also brings innovative data protection capabilities like SQL Ledger, a blockchain inside the SQL Server engine. We also know we don't have an engine if we are not the best at performance and availability. While our record-breaking benchmarks prove we are the leader in price performance, we know we need to provide an engine that adapts to your workload, giving you faster performance with no code changes. That is what built-in query intelligence is all about. Speaking of built-in query intelligence, let's dive a little deeper into the performance enhancements that we've been working on, specifically with what I call Intelligent Query Processing NextGen. You know, when you upgrade to SQL Server 2022, you get new features regardless of your DB compat level. First, you get approximate percentile, which can help speed up analytic queries. In addition, you get optimized plan forcing, which records steps of compilation to help you avoid compile storms. In addition to these features, if you are using DB compat level 140 or later, you get more. If you remember, one of the things we did in SQL 17 and 19 was a feature called Memory Grant Feedback. So in SQL Server 2022, if you're using DB compat 140, or above, we have improved the feedback algorithm and can now persist feedback to survive planned cache eviction or server restarts. In addition to both these areas, if you're using the new DB compat 160, you get more capabilities. The first is parameter-sensitive plan optimization. Can we finally save the world from parameter sniffing? The engine can now cache multiple plans for the same stored procedure based on statistics and parameter values. The second is cardinality estimation feedback. You have told us that in some cases you are forced to use the legacy cardinality estimation model for your database or queries. Now the query processor can automatically apply query hints based on a feedback mechanism and a known CE model query pattern. We know that trying to determine the best max DOP value for your system, database, or query can be difficult. So we're also introducing a feature called DOP feedback. Built into the query processor, this feature uses a feedback loop to lower DOP dynamically with no recompile required, preserving query duration while lowering the overall CPU for the system. All of these capabilities are built into the query processor, but some of them require the query store to be enabled to take effect. And don't forget, if you're using DB Compat level 140 or greater, you also get previous generations of IQP enhancements from SQL Server 2017 and 2019. As I mentioned, the next gen of IQP in SQL Server 2022 is packed with new capabilities you need to solve common query performance issues with no code changes. Before we talk more about those cloud-connected features, I can't talk about SQL Server 2022 without touching on the vast set of core engine features for security, scalability, and availability. For security, this includes SQL Ledger, our built-in blockchain technology in the SQL engine. For scalability, this includes system page latch concurrency enhancements to make TempDB workloads just work with no tuning. And for availability, we are excited to announce contained availability groups. SQL Server will handle replicating SQL agent jobs, logins, and link servers along with your databases. We know this solves a long-standing challenge of maintaining high availability with SQL Server. We are also enhancing backup, including the ability to perform snapshot backups and harnessing the power of technologies like Intel Quick Assist for backup compressions. Did you know there are over 20 new engine features in SQL Server 2022? You can learn more at ak.ms SQL Server 2022 docs. Earlier, I mentioned a few of the cloud-connected features for this release. With SQL Server 2022, you can use Managed Instance for managed disaster recovery, or take advantage of Synapse for near real-time analytics. There's also Microsoft Purview to have a central governance site for access policies for authorization and authentication without having to create complex scripts for login and permissions in SQL Server. Plus, you can authenticate with Azure Active Directory to provide things like multi-factor authentication. And Microsoft Defender can continuously scan your system for vulnerability assessments and alert you to security threats. All of this is built into the SQL Server engine and connected to these different Azure services. We also use other well-known software to make it happen, including the self-hosted integration runtime and Azure Arc agents. Let's take a closer look at one of those cloud-connected capabilities and how Azure Synapse Link for SQL can bring you real-time insights without the pain of ETL. One of the first things I always want to make sure people know is that Synapse Link for SQL works both for SQL Server 2022 and Azure SQL Database. And based on some recent feedback, we're introducing some new exciting capabilities that apply to both. First, Schedule Mode will allow you to schedule when Synapse will ingest data into SQL pools, which can help you save costs in how you don't want to continuously ingest data. We also have introduced smaller compute capacity support, which reduces the minimum number of cores per link connection from 8 to 4 to lower costs for smaller scale workloads. And finally, we now have full support for date time and time data type precisions. So those are some features you may have missed as we've been iterating during the preview. And we're working towards other new features like VNet support, integration with Azure Monitor, and support for pre-existing Synapse workspaces. We're so excited to see the general availability of Azure Synapse Link for SQL coming soon. These cloud-connected features just don't work on their own, they're integrated. So it's possible to use Synapse Link to get data from SQL Server near real time, but also discover the data that you're going to sync with Purview, and then visualize that data once you get into the sets with Power BI. So let's see this in action. Now I need a SQL Server to synchronize to Synapse, and I've got SQL Server 2022 deployed in another machine, and I've restored the sample database wide role importers as a possible source of data to link to my Synapse system. You can see here in Management Studio the various types of tables that are available to me to synchronize. I've also modified wide role importers and added a few new tables that includes things like vehicles and stock items. Think of it like the cargo that are stored on various vehicles across various cities in my system. Before I link my data from SQL Server to Synapse, I'd like to do some exploration of the data. Purview integration allows me to do that. Purview has scanned my SQL Server database and finds out information like, for example, that the database is certified to use in my organization for analysis. I get information like who's the owner of the database and who are experts for me to ask questions as I decide which tables to link to my Synapse system. I can explore further. I can look at what schemas exist to discover more tables. I see here in the sales schema, there's a customers table. I'd like to know more about it. And Purview has rich exploration of metadata, like what classifications exist for this table, so I can make sure I'm following proper compliance in my organization. I can drill further to find out which classifications match to specific columns in this customers table. In addition, just like the database, I can find out who the owner of the table is, so I can make sure I'm compliant and I can ask more questions about it. I'd like to look more at the vehicles table, but I don't know what schema it's in. So I can go back to Purview Search, type in the word vehicles, and look at the catalog of information about the vehicles table. Just like other tables, I can look at schema classifications for this table, or I can drill in further to find out what columns exist in the table, which classifications match to those. Just like the database and other tables, I can see who the owner of the table is as well. This is an example of Purview integration with Synapse and SQL. Now it's time to synchronize my data from SQL Server to Synapse. I love that I can do all of this inside Synapse Studio. I've set up a link connection and chosen which source tables from SQL Server I'd like to synchronize to target tables inside Synapse. I specify my SQL Server, which I set up earlier, and my target SQL database in Synapse itself. And I specify also the landing zone that I built earlier, an Azure storage account, which holds, again, data temporarily to be ingested inside the Synapse workspace. With this synchronization now started, I can then go monitor the status of data being synchronized to SQL Server and Synapse, all right from Synapse Studio. I can drill in further, and I can see the status of the various tables that were set up from SQL Server and how they're being replicated into the Synapse system. Now that my data is synchronized, let's go explore this data inside Synapse Studio itself. These represent the various tables that have been synchronized from SQL Server into Synapse SQL tables and dedicated pools. You can even write a SQL script inside Synapse Studio and query the data in Synapse. Here, I've written a script to do a simple calculation of what is the cargo count across my various vehicles in various cities. And I can see a small tabular result of that data. Now, I love the fact that Power BI is very easily integrated with Synapse, so I was able to generate a simple report just based on the data itself to look at a map of the cargo counts across cities across the state of Texas. Now let's make some changes in SQL Server and see them reflected near real-time in Synapse. Connected to SQL Server, I just created a script to insert a random number of cargo items across various vehicles across various cities. Let's now see the data reflected inside Synapse. Using Synapse Studio and the same cargo count script, I can see my new cargo counts across these cities in various states. Integrated with Synapse, so it automatically reflects these changes. The color of the circles represent the size of cargo counts across cities. And everything I just showed you is all possible with Azure SQL Database as well. You've seen how SQL Server can connect to the cloud. Part of that connection is using technology from Azure Arc. Arc-enabled SQL Server, which is a new name for an existing member of the Arc-enabled family, connects your existing SQL Server to the cloud, allowing you to leverage some great Azure benefits. Azure Arc SQL Managed Instance and Azure Arc-enabled PostgreSQL give you a way to run a managed instance in the infrastructure of your choice, like a platform as a service. We've talked about it a little bit already, but there are some really new cool features, capabilities available for Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server. It is now integrated with SQL Server 2022 setup, connected with cloud security capabilities like single sign-on with Azure Active Directory with MFA and Microsoft Defender for the cloud, as well as the Microsoft governance solution Purview access policies. It also supports SQL Server on Linux, powered with SQL Server Best Practice Analyzer and Database as a resource. With Arc-enabled SQL Server, you can connect your SQL Server to Azure wherever it is and manage it from the cloud. I'm thrilled to share an exciting offering that's coming soon. Pay-as-you-go licensing for Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server. Customers who connect their SQL Server to Azure Arc will have flexible licensing options from traditional SQL Server licensing to pay-as-you-go pricing, so that you can pay for what you use no matter whether your SQL Server is on-prem, hybrid, or multi-cloud. This gives you benefit of cost efficiency and access to more Azure services, as we just talked about. We also have some new innovations we've recently made generally available in our Azure SQL family. First, there's window authentication for SQL Managed Instance, which enables you to migrate your legacy applications that rely upon Windows authentication with minimal or no changes in the application stack. And there is the Premium series, including memory-optimized hardware for SQL Managed Instance. It's going to give you three things: faster CPU, higher memory-to-core ratio, and larger database sizes for critical database tiers. We know many of you are looking to migrate to Azure SQL, so I'm excited to share some new announcements today. First, we'd like to announce two public previews: the Database Migration Assessment for Oracle in Azure Data Studio, and the Database Schema Conversion Toolkit for Oracle, also in Azure Data Studio. Database Migration Assessment, an Azure Studio extension powered by the Azure Database Migration Service, now offers a migration assessment for moving from Oracle databases to Azure SQL. The assessment includes database migration recommendations and an evaluation of database code complexity. Through the same tooling, customers can get target-size recommendations for Oracle database migration to Azure SQL, including Azure SQL Database Hyperscale, which is ideal for large workloads up to 100 terabytes. The Database Schema Toolkit automates schema migration between the different database platforms, and one of the best things here is that it runs on Linux environments. With these changes, migration planning is simplified for Oracle customers looking to modernize their data state to Azure Managed Databases. In addition, Azure Migrate, our central service for Azure migration, can now discover SQL Server instances and databases running in Microsoft Hyper-V and bare metal environments, as well as IaaS services of other public clouds such as AWS and GCP. This gives you a unified at-scale agentless discovery and assessment of SQL Server. Now you can use Azure Migrate to discover and assess SQL Server instance for migration everywhere they exist. While we're excited about the recent innovations in Azure SQL, we also love how they stack up against the competition. First, a recent study from GigaOM showed that SQL Server on Azure virtual machines versus SQL Server on AWS EC2 instances across analytic and transaction workloads, Microsoft came out on top, meeting customers' mission-critical requirements with up to 42% faster transactional performance while costing up to 31% less than AWS EC2. What's more, Principal Technologies, an independent research firm, recently published a study where they benchmarked SQL Managed Instance and SQL Server on Amazon Web Services AWS RDS across 3 different workloads. SQL Managed Instance emerged as the leader across each of these workloads, with up to 5 times faster performance at up to 93% less cost than AWS RDS. We've covered a lot of new innovations in the SQL space, but it's important to remember that all of these new features and updates run on the same core engine, meaning you get the same experience with the same tools, languages, and platforms no matter where you're running. Azure SQL Database is no exception to that. The team has been working on innovations in this space for over a decade, but recently we've created some new experiences for developers. No one knows more about that than Anna Hoffman, who's going to share more about how we're addressing developer needs.
Thanks, Bob. Happy to. As Bob mentioned, SQL Database is built on the powerful SQL Server engine and has a strong history of innovation built upon addressing the needs of our customers. Azure SQL Database was part of the original Windows Azure announcement back in 2008. Since then, we've been innovating with capabilities like hyperscale and serverless, striving to make Azure SQL Database the best database on the planet for modern applications. On that note, let's talk a little bit about some enhancements we've recently released I know our developers out there are going to really appreciate. We're always listening to what you and other customers tell us, so we know that modern apps require more. I want to highlight some of the recent announcements aimed at helping developers have seamless data access and easy integrations with other services, all while having support for DevOps. Now, developers tell us they love Azure Functions because it gives a serverless solution to use with their cloud applications. Binding data in Azure Functions, however, has been challenging, so earlier this year we announced public preview of Azure Functions integration with Azure SQL Database, which essentially includes SQL input and output bindings and support for .NET, Node.js, and Python. Next, we know JSON data is everywhere, and if developers want to use T-SQL, it must provide capabilities to process JSON data. Now, today we support JSON data, but we recently announced enhancements to the isJSON function and 3 new T-SQL functions. JSON path exists for testing, and JSON object and JSON array for construction. By the way, these JSON functions are supported in not just Azure SQL Database, but also Azure SQL Managed Instance and SQL Server 2022. We also know developers need to work in online and offline environments. So in preview today, we have an Azure SQL Database local development experience. So let's talk about what we mean when we say local developer experience. We will now allow you to develop and test databases locally, publish updates through CI/CD pipelines, and support Workstation or GitHub Codespaces environments. We do this through a set of Visual Studio Code extensions and an emulator for Azure SQL Database that uses containers. Let's take a look at a scenario. So in our scenario, we have an app where we are updating to enter and automatically process work orders for technicians. Behind the scenes, it's running multiple processes. There's an online form to create work orders. Those get entered as a new row into an Azure SQL database, and as each new row is entered, it triggers an operation to map the location, which is then written back into the same row of the database. Then a few additional operations using Azure Functions to find the closest technician with availability to do the job, assigns it to them, and writes that information back into the database. Now, in this case, I'm working in a different region to various members of my dev team who are also working on different OS platforms and need to connect to the data backend. Normally, it wouldn't be a problem connecting to a cloud database, or even if I ran servers on VMs in our data center. That said, we need more than 1 instance per person, so it could get expensive. And that's where the Azure SQL Database emulator comes in, which gives you the option of creating a local consistent copy instead. Here, I'm starting from VS Code. You'll see that I have a create table operation with all my columns. In connections, you can see my work order DB, which is a connection to an existing Azure SQL database. If I don't already have my database schema as code, I can quickly create a project from an existing database. To save time, I've already done this, and in the database projects, you can see my work order database. It's just a right-click to pull up the publish command to build a local copy of the database with the emulator. You'll see this option called Publish to New Azure SQL Database Emulator. I'll leave the standard port 1433, enter the admin password, and then go ahead and confirm. Now I can select which version. I'm going to choose the light version because it's a smaller image and covers the majority of the use cases. For the rest of the options, I'm going to keep the default settings and go ahead and kick off this deployment. Now, once this deployment completes, the emulator with a local copy of the database is going to be available for my code. And if you were using Azure Data Studio, you can start from there too and have the exact same experience. And the great news is none of this even requires an Azure subscription, and you can do all of it for free. And of course, you can connect to it as you write your code. Now, once this DAC pack is deployed, we'll be able to switch back over to the connections and take a look at my local instance. And you can see the local host there, and our emulator is ready to go. So we have the workflow and the local components, but now we need to start coding. Let's start by digging into our data connections and workflow to update what our app can do. In the past, we'd run a combination of real-time operations and daily batch jobs, but now we want everything event-driven so that we can respond to our customers faster. There's a brand new stored procedure available called SP Invoke External REST Endpoint, so once our form inserts a row into our SQL database, it triggers a REST API, which in turn uses an Azure function with our payload and address information needed to map a location. This stored procedure also allows us to call out to an Azure function endpoint each time the work order form is submitted. Another interesting thing about this is we're using JSON formats as the content type. The SQL engine can both validate JSON documents or convert SQL data into JSON, like we're doing here, to post data to Azure functions using that JSON. Our new workflow invokes Azure Maps to calculate longitude and latitude of a location. So I can dig into our orchestration code, passing and receiving data from Azure Functions, using Azure SQL bindings to write data to our Azure SQL database with the latitude and longitude coordinates for each work order. Again, we're going to use those coordinates to assign the closest available technician. Let's test this out and see what's written back to our table. So I'm in Azure Data Studio now, and I'm going to simulate what filling in the form for 3 work orders would look like. You can see the 3 rows with everything populated except the latitude and longitude columns. Remember, as those were created, the SQL trigger fired and called our new stored procedure to invoke its function asynchronously, which posts everything to Azure Maps to calculate the coordinates and write them back to our database. So I can run this simple select query against our work orders object to see the change. So you can now see that the latitude and longitude columns have the values added. The only thing I like sharing more than a demo is an announcement, and I'm happy to say I was able to get permission to share a couple things that will be coming soon. Developers are looking for innovative methods to integrate data with other services. Since most services support REST endpoints, you can now use stored procedures in Azure SQL Database to push data from the SQL engine with T-SQL to just about any REST endpoint you can think of. This is going to enable you to use the power of T-SQL to push data within the engine to machine learning services, Event Hub, or any REST endpoint you could create. You can even activate workflows for Azure Logic apps or notify SignalR websites, all integrated with your SQL code. Additionally, memory-optimized premium series hardware will deliver even more memory per vCore for your most memory-intensive SQL database hyperscale workloads. And finally, we're particularly excited about the Data API Builder. This feature will provide modern REST and GraphQL endpoints to your Azure databases, boosting your efficiency through integration with Azure SQL databases. With the Data API Builder, database objects can be exposed via REST or GraphQL endpoints so that your data can be accessed using modern techniques by any platform with any language on any device. With an integrated and flexible policy engine, granular security is also assured. Pretty exciting, right? But I can go one step further and actually show you the Data API Builder. Now, the SP invoke external REST endpoint stored procedure you saw earlier calls an API directly from Azure SQL to calculate geolocation. But the technician also needs some sort of mobile app to know where and when they have to go. Normally, you'd have to write a bunch of plumbing code to wire up the requests coming from the mobile app to get the data saved in Azure SQL database. In fact, I'm going to pull up some code that you would normally need to write. You can see there are dozens of lines of code needed to connect and perform operations against our database. We've got our class for our work order with the fields mapped to the table, our get function and our connection string to SQL, our logic with our select statements to get the data, and the code to fetch back our coordinates from the mapping service. And I could use this to build out a REST API, but I'm going to show you how this gets better with the new Data API Builder. And with it, you can build an equivalent or better API with a lot less effort. In addition to get, you can use it for commands to update, create, or delete. So much coding this is going to save you. Let me show you how to configure one in VS Code. So I've initialized the Data API Builder. Now I'll add my worker API setting with the desired permissions. And you can see that everything can be done within this JSON config file. Once I have the config file all set up, I'm going to start the runtime engine, which uses the config file. Starting that up, we can see that it's working. Using Insomnia, a great REST client, you'll see these entries under Data API Builder on the left. I'll send a request to get a single work order, and it immediately returns our coordinate data. This time, I'll send a request to get multiple work orders, and I have the option to customize the result set. So I'll remove this select parameter, and it will return everything that I'm looking for. Then when I add that parameter back, you'll see it's only going to return ID, summary, and location. So this small change in the get string is effectively changing my query. Imagine how complicated this would be if I needed to manage all these queries and combinations in my code. We just saw REST APIs, but this also works for GraphQL. Here, I'm just using a few lines of code to filter locations on Seattle. And you'll see everything returns for Seattle only. And that's just one example. I could apply similar logic to any of the other fields. For example, I could apply this for latitude. And this flexibility means you can optimize speed, bandwidth, and even things like battery usage while executing operations on your apps, saving hundreds of lines of code in the process and making it easier to roll out new features later. The last topic we're going to cover today is data governance and visibility through Microsoft Purview. Data has become ubiquitous across on-prem, multi-cloud, and software-as-a-service applications. And in an environment of constantly evolving regulations, getting holistic and actionable insights has truly become a challenge, particularly for the Chief Data Officer. That's why we have Sunetra Virdi here to walk us through all the latest and greatest in Microsoft Purview that will help build a strong governance story in your organization.
Thanks, Anna. Wow, it's been an exciting year for us at Microsoft Purview as we've been focused on increasing the breadth and usage for your customers. Let's do a quick recap of Microsoft Purview. Purview is a unified hybrid data governance platform that creates a map of your data estate comprising Azure data sources such as Azure SQL and on-prem SQL Server, as well as multi-cloud and SaaS data systems such as SAP, Teradata, Snowflake, AWS, GCP, and many more. On top of the rich data map, organizations can build robust governance programs. For cloud-scale search and discovery, we have the Catalog app. For deeper insights and analytics into your governance program, we have the Data Estate Insights app. Microsoft Purview is truly the one-stop shop for technical, governance, and business stakeholders to map and curate their metadata and govern their hybrid data estate. With that, let's jump into some of the exciting announcements. Microsoft Purview can also now classify person names and addresses using machine learning, which is a huge leap from regex-based classifications. We are announcing the public preview of manual data lineage, where data stewards can now indicate data movement across data stores in cases where data movement happens in the real world, but graphs are not captured in data map. We are also excited to announce general availability of dynamic data lineage on Azure SQL. Now, data engineers and analysts can do thorough impact analysis using lineage graphs from stored procedures along with runtime information. I also need to mention one of my personal favorites, meta models. With the public preview of this feature, customers can now create a semantic view on top of the data map to drive cross-functional data governance. And finally, we are excited to announce the public preview of another game-changing capability, auto-provisioning and self-service data access on Azure SQL Database. Instead of me telling you more about these features, let's dive into a demo and you can see it for yourself how things work. Here we are at the home screen of Contoso, where I will type retail to look for retail data. As you can see on the left navigation, I can filter by data, by business objects, organization. I'm looking at line of business, which is retail. And I scroll down to filter by classification, which is person's name. Now let's start with a scenario where I am the data analyst who is looking for access to the data for a reporting project, and I use Microsoft's self-service access policy to get that access. As you can see, I'm trying to connect to the SQL Server that has the data that I need, but I don't have access to the data. So I come into Microsoft Purview, and in authoring of workflows, I see there is a workflow to grant me access to the data that has the right conditions and approvers for the workflow, and a grant access for time of 1 day. I go back from requests and approvals to policies, where the self-service access policy doesn't exist today. So I go to the home page, browse by assets, look for the source type of Azure SQL database, and find the database that I need access to, which is policy DB01, and request access from the database. I hit send, which is going to send the approvers an email, as well as an approval request can be seen on Management Center. Now, In Management Center, I see a workflow, which is pending for request approvals. I am one of the approvers, so I go in. I can see myself here, and I provide myself access to the requested database. Going back into policies, into self-service access policy, now you can see there is a policy created with the requester as myself for a day of 1. And now I go into my database, try to reconnect using the same credentials, and I should be able to log right in. As you can see, now the database shows all the tables under policy DB01 that I can use for my reporting project. Now let's look at how dynamic lineage for Azure SQL in Microsoft Purview unlocks analysis opportunities for the data engineer and data analyst community. As I browse by assets in Azure SQL, I see tables in Microsoft Purview, but no stored procedure. However, in the database, I have a stored procedure called SP Monthly Sales Revenue that joins a few of these tables to produce an output. With the help of dynamic lineage, as I execute the stored procedure, it should automatically get mapped into Microsoft Purview along with the execution details for root cause analysis. Let's go ahead and do that. Going back into Purview, the stored procedure now shows up in the catalog. Microsoft Purview automatically unpacks the stored procedure and shows its end-to-end lineage with a quick visual analysis. This is super time saver, as analysts don't need to depend on DBAs to help with upstream and downstream analysis. In the properties of the stored procedure, I click on Runs, and in the properties, I can see the mapping of columns, execution time, run duration, and time of run, along with count of rows inserted in the target tables. With so much rich information in the hands of the analysts, troubleshooting becomes easy and data source owner's intervention is only needed for targeted tasks. With that, now let's look at meta models. Now back in the data map, you can find a section called meta model. When you click into asset types in the meta model section, it shows you the semantic data map of your organization. Here, you can see the organization's business asset has a line of business which has department and department owns business processes, and so on. This is our out-of-the-box mapping. In this section, you can also create custom concepts that benefit your organization. You can link data assets to data sets and data products to define consumer and producer relationship. Now let's go back to the data catalog where I've already added some data assets. In my catalog, I have created some departments that are linked to 2 lines of business. I have 3 data products within these departments. Let's click on Retail Customer Product. In the Overview tab, you can see the data sets that are consumed by the data product and their linked data sets. You can also see relationship between logical data assets in the lineage graph. And specifically, you can see the data sets are linked to actual data from SQL tables. If you want access to the data product that can give you access to all the underlying tables of the data, you can contact the data owner to do so. That brings us to the end of meta models. I think now you can see what is possible with Microsoft Purview. We're so excited to see our customers start extracting real value out of these new features. And now, let me turn it back to Bob to wrap things up.
Thank you, Sunetra. Wow, we've covered a lot, including a bunch of new announcements with great demonstrations. Here's some key takeaways. You get a consistent experience with our SQL engine from cloud to edge. SQL Server 2022 delivers more cloud benefits than any release yet. Synapse Link for SQL brings you real-time insights without the pain of ETL. We now have flexible licensing options for Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server. Your mission-critical workloads run the best on Azure SQL. Azure SQL Database has great new features for making developers' lives easier. And Microsoft Purview is a central governance hub for your data estate. Most importantly, we demonstrated how these products and features work seamlessly together to help you do more with less. Before I leave you, I want to make sure you know about some other great related sessions here at Ignite. And don't forget about Ask the Expert sessions immediately following the session. Thanks so much for attending today's session, and I hope you enjoy the rest of time at Ignite 2022.